Here begins tape one of Dr. Gary Rubin, taken in the matter of Kevin Tolson versus St. Agnes Healthcare, Inc. et al. In the Circuit Court for Baltimore City, case number 24-C-12-008071. Today's date is March 6th, 2014. The time on the video is 1:05. The video operator today is Kim Johnson. This video deposition is taking place at 11120 New Hampshire Avenue, Silver Spring, Maryland. Counsel, please identify yourselves for the record.
Rodney M. Gaston, and I represent the plaintiff, Kevin Tolson.
Danielle Dinsmore, present on behalf of defendants Prudence Jackson, M.D., Kruppa Shaw, P.A., and Maryland Provo 1 Medical Services.
The court reporter today is Nancy Barker.
Wait, hold on. I'm sorry.
The court reporter today is Nancy Barker on behalf of Merrill Legal Solutions. She will swear the witness and we can proceed.
Would you please, Rodney? Do you solemnly declare or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Good afternoon, Doctor. Could you please state your name and business address?
Sure. Gary, Garry, D. Rubin, Ruben, 11120 New Hampshire Avenue, Suite 201, Silver Spring, Maryland, 20904.
Doctor, the reason I've asked you to appear here today to take your deposition is because you've been identified by one or more of the defendants in this case as an expert who may render opinions in this case. And I'm here today to find out generally what opinions you intend to give in this case. And I presume you've had your deposition taken before.
I have.
If at any time I ask you a question that you don't understand, please stop me, tell me you don't understand, and I'll try to rephrase it. Otherwise, if you don't do that, we'll assume that you've understood the question and you've answered it accordingly. Also, if at any time you want to take a break, just let us know. Doctor, I want to hand you what's been marked as Deposition Exhibit number 1. This is the amended notice for your deposition here today. Attached to that notice is a list of items we asked you to bring with you to your deposition today. Can you tell me what, if any, items you brought with you, and if they're contained on a computer, you can also reference those as well.
Well, in all fairness, I don't remember seeing this, but I can tell you what I have here. You just want to go through these and tell you what I have and what I don't have?
Well, pretty much what you've brought with you. I think if we go over with what you brought with you.
Okay.
Some of that we've objected to, so if you just let them know.
I brought my CV, which I've given to you, and I've got the medical records and depositions and other things that I've reviewed pertinent to the case.
Is it possible for you to list the items that you reviewed in this case?
I'll do my best. I'm going to have to go sort of slowly because I've got to get each one out. But I have the plaintiff's designation. I have a copy of the complaint, certificates of qualified experts. I have medical records from St. Agnes Hospital and the University of Maryland Medical Center. Deposition of Kevin Tolson. The Baltimore County Ambulance Report. Let's see, deposition of Linda Margison, Dr. Sarkar. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if that's Dr. Sarkar, but Mahad Malik. Deposition, I believe, of Dr. Larson. let's see. Jeffrey Nicholson, PA. Gregory Sachs. Sharon Craddock. Stacy Tolson, I think. Let me double check that. Yeah. No, I'm sorry, that's not a deposition. That was a picture, I think. And then I think the deposition of Dr. Collier, I believe, and Dr. Black. I'm pretty sure that's what I've reviewed.
Okay.
And it's possible I've missed something. If I have, I apologize.
Okay. Doctor, were you sent any radiology studies?
I don't think, no, I don't believe I was.
Do you plan on commenting on any of the radiology studies in this case?
No.
Okay.
And Rodney, as I offered before the deposition, we'll send you a comprehensive list of everything that we sent Dr. Rubin.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, did you actually read all of the items that you just read into the record?
Yes, at one point or another I did.
Okay. All right. Doctor, were you shown any animations?
I think I did receive those, yes. Now that you mentioned it, I believe I have the animation of the accident as it could have or would have occurred.
And how about animation showing a mechanism of injury, a rotating knee with torn ligaments in it, and a picture of a back of a leg with an animation depicting blood flowing down the back of the leg?
At least some of that. If it was all together, I would have seen it all.
Okay. Have you reached any opinions one way or the other as to whether or not those animations fairly and accurately depict what they show?
Objection?
I would say they are suggestive of one way. I don't think anybody will ever, in my opinion, will ever really know exactly what happened in terms of the forces and the rotations of the knee.
Okay. And how about the actual knee image that shows the destruction of the ligaments in his knee?
Objection?
Do you have any opinion one way or the other whether that's a fair and accurate depiction?
Again, I think that trying to depict it at this point in time based on the information is just an educated guess, and I would certainly not think that anybody could adequately or within a reasonable degree of medical certainty really know exactly what happened with the knee based on the evidence I see in the records. But I don't have an opinion on exactly what did happen.
Okay. And the same with respect to the image that shows the arteries and it attempts to show the blood flowing down through the arteries.
I don't remember them well enough to tell you at this point.
Okay. Okay. Doctor, do you plan on giving, I'm sorry, Doctor, you've testified in medical malpractice cases before, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you're familiar with opinions that have to do with the standards of medical care, correct?
Correct.
Do you plan on giving any opinions on the standards of medical care by any of the medical providers in this case?
I guess the only way I can answer that is generally speaking, no. Certainly if one were to ask me as a vascular surgeon what I would have expected from an emergency room physician or PA with regard to, or even nurses with regard to what I would expect as a vascular surgeon, I'd be willing to proffer those opinions. But in terms of actual standard of care opinions about their work, not really.
Okay. All right. And Doctor, you were kind enough to provide us with a copy of your CV, which has been marked as Exhibit Number 2. Is that a current CV of yours?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. And Doctor, are you still earning approximately $50,000 a year for testifying in medical malpractice cases such as the one we have here with Mr. Tolson?
Objection?
No, I would say it's more around along the range of about $100,000, give or take.
$100,000 per year?
Yeah, 100, maybe even 120, somewhere in that range.
And do you know for how long you've been earning that amount of money for testifying in medical malpractice cases?
Probably about 4 or 5 years now.
Okay. And do you know what the percentage of the time that you spent in your forensic work as it relates to work for defendant medical providers versus the injured patient?
Oh, it's about 70% defendant work and 30% plaintiff work.
Okay. And doctor, what field of medicine are you board certified in?
I'm board certified in surgery.
Is that general surgery?
It says surgery. If you want to equate it that way, that's fine, but the board certification says surgery.
Okay. Is there any specialized board certifications for vascular surgery?
There is.
Okay. And are you certified in vascular surgery?
No, just surgery.
Okay. Does your medical practice involve vascular surgery?
It does.
Okay. Can you tell me, in the last 6 months, can you give me an idea of the types of surgical procedures you have performed?
Sure, I do carotid surgery, carotid artery surgery. I do surgery on the arteries of the lower extremities, bypass operations and angioplasties and thrombectomies. I do a number of hernias, gallbladders, abdominal surgery, colon resections, small bowel resections, breast surgery, head and neck surgery, lumps and bumps, amputations. I mean, I do most of the bread and butter of some abdominal aortic aneurysms and popliteal aneurysms. That would just encompass some of it, but certainly not all of it.
Okay. You said a mouthful. Can you give me an idea, percentage-wise, what percentage of your operation has to do with gallbladder surgeries, abdominal surgeries, carotid surgeries, vascular surgeries?
No. I mean, I can give you a general idea of vascular versus general.
If you can do that for me.
Yeah, I mean, it runs a little more vascular than general. Having said that, there are also things that cross into both areas. For example, vascular access, such as ports and catheters, even dialysis access. Some general surgeons do it, some vascular surgeons do it. But overall, I would say that I do a little bit more vascular work than I do general surgical work, but it's not far off of 50-50.
When's the last time you performed a foot amputation?
Well, when you say a foot amputation, if we include, leg amputation, either one, within the last 2-3 weeks.
And can you tell me over the last 5 years how many times you performed a lower extremity amputation?
I probably do about 20 a year. So in 5 years, probably 100 or more.
Okay. And can you tell me how many times you have performed surgeries to repair injury to a popliteal artery?
Well, specifically for traumatic injury to the popliteal artery, I would say over the years 20 or 30.
And how many years have you been practicing as a surgeon?
About 27 years.
Average is about 1 a year?
1 or 2 a year at most. Yeah, I mean, it's not a common injury. It's a very uncommon injury.
Okay. Do you treat knee dislocations?
Not specifically. I mean, I may be involved if there's a popliteal artery injury if there's a knee dislocation, but specific to knee dislocations, generally I wouldn't be involved because most of them don't involve the vascular system.
Okay. And of the popliteal artery surgeries you performed, I think you said between 20 and 30.
No, I said repair of trauma.
Trauma.
I've done hundreds of popliteal artery surgeries.
Okay. Let's talk about the trauma surgeries, 20 to 30. Do you know of those 20 or 30, how many were the result of a knee dislocation?
Probably would say about a third of them were from knee dislocation, and the others were, a third of them were from some kind of knee injury, traumatic, usually blunt force trauma. Whether it was a knee dislocation, I don't know that I always know whether it is or it's not. The others would be penetrating or other injuries to the artery.
And generally speaking, how do you become involved in the traumatic popliteal artery injury repair?
Generally speaking, an orthopedic surgeon who is called to see the patient, or generally in the operating room, either is operating on the patient, generally reducing the dislocation. When he dislocates it, you hope and generally expect that if the artery has lost its pulse because it's pinched, that the pulse will come back in the foot. If, however, after relocating the knee, the pulse does not return to the foot, then there's a problem for which I get consulted.
Okay. And do you actually go to the emergency room at the hospital?
Well, usually I'm called to the operating room at the hospital,
And what hospitals do you currently operate?
currently at Holy Cross.
And do you hold any administrative or staff positions at Holy Cross?
Yes.
And what are they, doctor?
I'm president of the medical staff. I'm chief of the subsection of vascular surgery, and I'm on a number of committees.
Okay. Doctor, do you believe that there are any medical articles, journals, or textbooks that are reasonably reliable for the medical issues involved in this case?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Do you intend to refer to or use any medical articles, journals, or textbooks in support of or an explanation of any of the opinions you intend to give in this case?
No, not at this time.
Doctor, can you tell me, in your experience, is a knee dislocation a potentially limb-threatening injury?
On rare occasions, it can be.
Okay. And have you experienced cases where there was a knee dislocation with a injury to the popliteal artery?
Yes.
Okay. And can you tell me, from your experience, how many knee dislocations that occur outside the hospital are reduced where the bones return to the normal anatomical position before the patient arrives at the hospital?
I have no idea.
Okay. And do you know the percentage of knee dislocations that result in injuries to popliteal arteries?
It's a very low percentage, but I don't know the numbers.
Okay. Doctor, I believe you testified that you read Dr. Sarkar's deposition testimony?
I'm sure I did.
Okay. And he's do you know Dr. Sarkar?
No.
Okay. He's a vascular surgery. He's an actual vascular surgery surgeon that actually amputated Mr. Tolson's foot at University of Maryland Hospital. Is there anything about his opinions that stand out to you to the point where you disagree with them?
Objection.
I don't recall offhand. I have not read his deposition in at least a month or so, so I can't recall anything that I would say right now, no.
Okay. Did you take any notes when you read any of the medical records or any of the depositions in this case?
No.
Okay. And have you sent any correspondence to defense counsel with respect to any of your opinions?
No, sir.
Okay. Can I ask Madam Clerk to mark this as the next exhibit? And Doctor, do you remember when you were first contacted by defense counsel to act as an expert in this case?
No.
Okay. Do you know when you reached your opinions in this case?
Not specifically, no.
Okay. I have a letter from defense counsel, Ms. Dinsmore, dated August 15th, 2013, where she identified you as an expert witness in this case. Do you believe you reached your opinions as of that date?
Objection.
I don't recall.
Okay. What I'm going to do, I'm going to show you the letter that defense counsel sent me. And on page 5, item number 4, it lists you as an expert who's going to testify in the case. And I want you to read the paragraphs carefully. And with respect to the paragraphs that indicate the opinions that you're going to give, I just want to know if you still intend to give those opinions. And you can go over them one by one if you'd like. And if any of your opinions have changed since that, just let me know too.
Can you try to keep your voice up a little bit more, please?
I'm doing the best I can.
You actually got really good right at the end of your last question, but you've gotten a little bit softer generally.
I'm sorry, the cell phone we're using is not that great.
I know. I understand. I am making it out. It's just having to be completely still.
Well, I'm going to have to sort of take these one at a time.
Yes, doctor, please do so.
So if that's okay, because
Sure.
otherwise it's just going to be very difficult.
Absolutely.
Starting with paragraph 3.
Right.
It does say that, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, that I am going to testify with regard to the standard of care from the perspective of a vascular surgeon called to the emergency room as a consultant. And so I would say yes, I'm going to testify that had I been called either by the emergency room or to the emergency room and had been told what had been done, that from a vascular perspective, I would have said it was appropriate. So that would be that.
What was appropriate? I'm sorry.
Evaluating from a vascular perspective, the evaluation and care rendered with respect to the vascular system of that patient.
And by all the providers that performed the vascular assessment?
In general, that the care provided was appropriate based on the information contained in the records, which I believe would have been communicated to me.
I want to do you plan on, okay, that from a more specific perspective, there are many persons who apparently were involved in the care of Mr. Tolson. Is it your opinion that all of them who were involved in the care, who performed a vascular assessment of Mr. Tolson, performed a proper vascular assessment?
No, that's not what I said.
Okay.
And I'll say it as clearly as I can. The patient's vascular system was assessed in general appropriately. 3 different people found that he had pulses in his foot. From a vascular perspective, that would have been an appropriate vascular evaluation such that I would have then felt that the patient had been assessed appropriately in general and that there was no need for further vascular workup or evaluation.
So is it your testimony that if you had been called for a vascular consultation on Mr. Tolson in the emergency room on December 3rd, 2009, that you would have relied upon the information provided to you by the individuals who had previously performed the vascular assessment of Mr. Tolson, found that to be adequate, and not performed your own individual vascular assessments?
Not what I said.
Objective form.
Okay. Say it again.
If I'm called to do a vascular consultation, I go to the hospital and do a vascular consultation. What I just said to you is that based on the information given to me from a vascular perspective, the patient's vascular system was in general assessed appropriately, and the actions taken based on that were appropriate. If I get called to do a consult, I come in and do the consult. And obviously, shouldn't say obviously. And if I come in and do a consult, I'm going to do my own assessment. Those are 2 different things.
Okay. So your opinion is limited to the vascular assessment that was performed by the staff at St. Agnes Hospital on December 3rd, 2009.
Correct. Which would just, yes. I mean, the answer is yes. I'm not worried about the orthopedic assessment. That's not my area of expertise.
Okay. You can continue, Doctor.
Okay. Let me see where I was. Okay. Okay, again, with respect to the next paragraph, as I said, it didn't suggest a vascular injury, and I would agree with that. I would not necessarily, I think the 5th line down, I would not opine the diagnosis that a knee sprain was reasonably based. I mean, that's not something I would comment on. So I will simply say that I would leave that up to the orthopedic surgeon as to whether that was a reasonable diagnosis at that point in time. With respect to the line that begins also, I would say that that what they did in not ordering any diagnostic testing from a vascular surgical specialist, I would certainly opine about. I'm not going to opine whether an orthopedic surgeon should have been consulted. That's not my area. And then the last sentence is certainly reasonable. There would have been no reason upon discharging him to have him seen by a vascular surgeon. The final paragraph. I would agree with.
Everything.
Let me look at the last sentence. I apologize. Up until the last sentence. Okay, it talks about the mechanism of injury. I'm not going to talk about the mechanism of injury in terms of the orthopedic injury, but I will talk about what happened to the artery. So just to clarify that, I'm not going to be opining whether this was a twist, a turn, a dislocation, or what, but I will be identifying, in my opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, what happened to the vessel that subsequently caused it to thrombose and when it thrombosed.
Doctor, there's one sentence here in that last. There's one sentence here in that last paragraph that I want to talk to you about. Is it your opinion that even if a vascular injury had been detected on December 3rd, 2009, while he was at the hospital, more likely than not, Mr. Tolson's leg could not be salvaged, given his presentation and the nature of his injury?
I think it probably could be worded better because that may be a little misleading. First of all, I don't think a vascular injury would have been detected at the time he was at the hospital that day. If there had been some thought that there might have been some vascular problem and imaging studies had been done, they likely at that point would not have shown anything. He would subsequently have developed the condition that he developed and likely thrombosed the popliteal artery abruptly, and that more likely than not, based on that occurrence, he still would have lost the leg because of what happens in an otherwise healthy patient with non-arteriosclerotic disease who abruptly obliterates the popliteal artery. So I think certainly if you were prescient and you repaired this popliteal artery before there was any problem noted or detected or could be detected, sure, you could have saved his leg. But given how it would have occurred, I think his leg more likely than not was going to be lost.
Okay, so if I understand your opinion, and we're going to assume that he had an injury to his popliteal artery for my next question, and that was able to be detected in the emergency room at St. Agnes Hospital on December 3rd, 2009. Assuming all those facts to be true, do you believe if there was a vascular intervention at that time, that more likely than not his leg could have been saved?
Objection.
If there had been a vascular intervention at that point, yes, his leg could have been saved. However, and just as a point, it would not have been indicated at that point in time.
And to what extent would the injury to the popliteal artery have to progress in order for a vascular intervention to have been appropriate while he was in the emergency room on December 3rd, 2009?
Objection of form.
Well, I mean, it didn't happen, so I don't know how I can possibly answer that question. There's nothing that occurred in the hours that he was in the emergency room that it would have prompted a vascular intervention.
Do you believe Mr. Tolson sustained an injury to the intimal flap of his popliteal artery?
I think he injured the wall of the vessel. I don't know that it was specifically the intimal flap, but he injured the wall of the vessel.
And what are the types of injuries to the wall of the vessels that can occur? Intimal flap being one, are there others?
Sure, you could have a full through penetrating injury. You could have an injury to the adventitia and media of the artery that is a compromise of those tissues with trauma. You could injure all three layers of the vessel, so there's a variety of things that could happen that can either weaken the artery or cause a flap in the artery or cause a through and through injury to the artery.
Okay. Have you eliminated some of those injuries? A through and through artery injury, a dissection type of injury? Are you able to eliminate some of those injuries?
Well, I don't know if it's more of an elimination. I believe I know what happened to this patient based upon the subsequent operative findings.
And what injury do you believe he sustained to his popliteal artery other than an injury to the wall of the vessel? Can you be more specific?
Sure. I think he likely somehow traumatized the wall of the vessel, weakened, and had a degeneration of the media and adventitia of the vessel. And over the hours on the later after discharge, he likely developed a pseudoaneurysm of the artery. And we know that aneurysms and pseudoaneurysms of the popliteal artery their major risk is acute thrombosis and loss of the limb. So I believe that subsequent to his discharge, he developed a pseudoaneurysm. Sometime on the 4th, he abruptly and acutely, either late on the 4th or early on the 5th, he abruptly occluded the vessel, had complete stasis and vascular insufficiency of the extremity, and was unable to be revascularized and lost his leg.
Do you believe that the initial injury to the popliteal artery that Mr. Tolson sustained occurred on December 3rd, 2009, when his leg got caught in the fence?
I do.
Okay. All right. Now, do you believe that Mr. Tolson sustained any other traumatic injury
Objection.
to his popliteal artery after he left St. Agnes Hospital on December 3rd, 2009?
I mean, not that I'm aware of or that changed the outcome of this case. I mean, except obviously for the surgery, which is a traumatic injury in a sense.
Okay. So we have the continuum of the initial injury on December 3rd, a degeneration of the artery itself, developing into a pseudoaneurysm, and then a thrombosis resulting in a blood clot.
Well, a thrombosis is a clotting of the vessel.
Okay.
So, I mean,
I understand. All right, Doc. Can you tell me what time frame the pseudoaneurysm developed?
sure, probably within a few hours of his discharge. It would have been possibly detectable. Initially, and for a few hours, you likely would not have been able to detect it with any imaging studies. After his discharge, he begins to enlarge this vessel and enlarge this pseudoaneurysm. And over the next several hours, as it's enlarging, it becomes at risk for thrombosing, which it likely did late on the 4th or early on the 5th.
Can you give me an hour window of when the thrombosis occurred?
I mean, I think he came to the emergency room, back to the emergency room, I think at 11 a.m., if I'm not mistaken, 11:09 a.m. I don't want to confuse my times. I have to, and unfortunately,
I think you're actually accurate.
yeah, I think it was 11:09.
Yeah, I believe you're
So
correct.
I would say that likely within 12 hours of that period of time is what he would have thrombosed. So we'll say 11 o'clock the prior evening. And obviously he said something was wrong, so we'll say between 11 o'clock the previous night and 4 or 5 in the morning would be a rough estimate.
And would it be fair to say that you're unable to pinpoint any specific activity or action that resulted in the thrombosis?
No, it's usually not like that. It just happens when it happens.
Okay. Do you have an opinion whether Mr. Tolson, I mean, this is an orthopedic question, but perhaps you can answer it with your expertise. Do you have an opinion whether he suffered a subsequent dislocation of his knee after the initial dislocation on December 3rd, 2009?
I don't have an opinion.
Okay. Do you believe that the injury to Mr. Tolson's popliteal artery recurred as a result of a posterior dislocation of his knee when his knee got trapped in the fence?
Have no idea, and I don't have an opinion on that. I just know he had trauma to his artery.
Okay. All right. Can you tell me what are some of the signs and symptoms a person experiences in their lower extremity when there's a decrease of blood flow into that extremity? What can a person experience?
Well, when you see a decrease in blood flow, you may have no symptoms at all. You may claudicate if there's a decreased amount of blood flow. If it's progressively slow onset of vascular insufficiency, you may begin to have some rest pain in your toes, along with what we call dependent rubor. They turn bright red. You may develop gangrene in the tips of your toes. Now, in this case, none of that applies.
I'm talking about more subtle symptoms such as paresthesia.
Paresthesia is not a symptom of vascular insufficiency.
It's not a sign or symptom?
Absolutely not.
Okay. So feeling pins and needles does not indicate a loss of blood supply to a lower extremity?
No.
Okay. How about numbness?
Numbness can, but it's usually associated with excruciating pain in the same area. So in other words, if you have severe critical acute arterial insufficiency of a lower extremity, your foot maybe both would be numb, but it would also be exquisitely painful.
How about an inability to move the foot?
That would be a rather late complication because you could still move your foot with proximal muscles, and even in the upper calf the muscles would still be patent and you can still move your foot around with the proximal vasculature. You may have inability to move your toes, would be a specific symptom of critical arterial insufficiency below the knee. But you could still move your foot because movement of the foot comes from proximal muscles in the anteriorly in the tibialis band and posterior muscles like the soleus and gastroc. And they get blood supply from above. And so commonly, even somebody with acute arterial insufficiency can move their foot, they just can't wiggle their toes. So no, usually that kind of a problem would not be vascular, it would be neurologic.
Can a person with acute arterial insufficiency still present with a palpable pulse in his foot?
No, unless you're talking about phlegmasia dolens, and that's not this situation.
Now, do you have any idea what caused the numbness in Mr. Tolson's leg?
I do.
And what is that?
Well, he clearly had a significant knee injury, and the nerve supplying sensation to the foot comes right adjacent to the artery. I have no doubt he suffered a stretch of the nerve and an apraxia, so that initially he had a nerve problem. For example, when you sleep on your arm, people commonly think it's because you wake up with your arm numb and then you get paresthesias. People think that's because you've blocked off the artery, and in fact that's not the case. What you've done is crimp the nerve, and you get a brief neuropraxia that you then get these paresthesias, pins and needles, as your hand wakes up. There's also some numbness, and that's because with the arm it's up in the shoulder area. That is, I believe, what happened here, because initially he had complained of some numbness, although it was never tested appropriately, so we don't really know whether he was insensate. And there's a difference between a patient saying they have some numbness and being insensate on physical examination. But in either case, based on further evaluations which showed him to be neurovascularly intact, it's clear to me that he had an apraxia of the nerve, and that after some time that began to come back.
Do you know how the medical providers tested him for sensation?
I mean, all I can say is that the only exams I see report being neurovascularly intact, and that would presume that they did a sensation test, and as I recall from depositions, they did test for sensation.
And how does a provider test for sensation?
Usually you touch the toes or the foot and see if the patient can feel you touching them and tell you where they're touching them.
You don't do a hard or soft test?
I don't. I just see if they can feel me touching them.
Okay. And if a patient can't feel you touching their foot in a traumatic injury setting such as Mr. Tolson had, would that give rise to suspicion of a injury to an artery?
Not with intact pulses, no.
Okay. And if the pulses were not intact, would that give rise to a suspicion for a arterial injury?
If I could not palpate a pulse in the foot and they were completely numb and complaining of severe pain, then I would be concerned about a vascular injury.
Okay. And are some of the symptoms that Mr. Tolson had in the emergency room consistent with a vascular injury?
Objection.
I would say not really, no. I mean, he had paresthesias, which is not consistent. He didn't have the kind of pain you'd expect from somebody who had obstructed their popliteal artery. He had palpable pulses. I mean, I'm sure we could pick and find something that might be seen in a patient with acute arterial insufficiency, but certainly in general, no, his symptoms were not consistent with it.
Well, his pain was at a 7 out of a 10.
Yeah, but I perceived that pain was in his knee, and there was never any report of severe pain in his toes or foot.
Okay. And if his pain went up from a 7 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10, would your opinion still be the same?
Yeah, I mean, I
Objection.
think I just answered the question pretty well.
Okay. And do you believe he sustained an injury to the nerve that runs along the back of the knee next to the popliteal artery at the same time the popliteal artery was injured?
I'm sure he suffered a stretch injury. I don't think it was ever torn or obliterated, but I have no doubt he suffered a stretch injury to the nerve.
You know, are you basing your opinion, what are you basing your opinion on that the thrombosis occurred 12 hours prior to his readmission to St. Agnes Hospital?
Okay. Beyond what I've already told you, on his readmission to St. Agnes Hospital, he had a myoglobin of 1,649. Had he had ischemia of his muscles for more than several hours, his myoglobin would have been in the 20 to 30,000 range. His creatinine was 1.5, indicating early and mild renal insufficiency, and returned back to normal with minimal rehydration, and it returned very rapidly, indicating extremely early ATN secondary to moderate myoglobin increase. Had he obliterated his artery on the 3rd, he would have had a creatinine well above 2.5, maybe even higher, and he would not have recovered that quickly from ATN. Finally, in the operating room, Dr. Wilkerson does report that his muscles are fairly viable. If he had been ischemic from a popliteal artery occlusion for more than 24 hours, his muscles would have looked gray, pale, and would not have responded to electrocautery. So everything about this case suggests that his popliteal artery occlusion and subsequent vascular insufficiency to his lower leg had to be less than 12 hours in length, 12, 15 hours in length.
In your opinion, did he sustain any reduction of the flow of blood in the popliteal artery down to his lower extremity while he was in the emergency room at St. Agnes Hospital?
No.
That question, Rodney?
Okay.
I'll let the court reporter read it back.
In your opinion, did he sustain any reduction of the flow of blood in the popliteal artery down to his lower extremity while he was in the emergency room at St. Agnes Hospital? Answer
Thank
no.
you.
Why do you hold that opinion, doctor?
Because, as I said to you, he has palpable pulses. In order to obliterate palpable pulses, you've got to have about an 80% reduction in the luminal area. I don't think there's any evidence that he had any reduction in the luminal area. In fact, he developed a pseudoaneurysm and abruptly thrombosed the vessel later on. So, I mean, I think his flow in the emergency room throughout this period of time was normal.
Is that from the presence of palpable pulses? Is that why you hold that opinion?
Well, it's that, plus, as we've already talked about, the subsequent findings would suggest that he didn't lose his... First of all, when you thrombose your popliteal artery, you thrombose it within minutes. It's not a slow onset event in this kind of an issue. So we've got to pick the point where this happened abruptly. Given the fact of the findings, when he returned to the hospital, which I've already delineated, I think, pretty clear, this could not have occurred until several hours before he came in. Since this is not a matter of narrowing the vessel, it's a matter of an aneurysm formation with normal flow through it, and then an abrupt occlusion, there would have had to have been normal flow in the emergency room. Now, yes, the palpable pulses essentially tell you that there has to be at least a 20 to 30% patent lumen to have a normal pulse in the foot. But I don't think there's any reason to suspect that he slowly had obliterated the lumen such that it was 20 or 30% in the emergency room and then occluded later. That's not the mechanism here.
So when he developed the pseudoaneurysm, at that time, it's your opinion that there was a termination of the flow of blood distal to the popliteal artery?
No.
Okay.
A pseudoaneurysm means there's a dilatation through a false lumen, through a false opening or a rent in the vessel that does not encompass all three layers. It can encompass one layer, but not all three. But there's still continuous flow through that. In other words, people can walk around with pseudoaneurysms of various areas because we get them all the time. It does not inhibit or narrow the blood flow below the pseudoaneurysm. Aneurysms are not obstructing lesions at all.
I'm sorry, I thought you said that when he developed a pseudoaneurysm, that interfered with the flow of blood south into his foot.
No, he developed a pseudoaneurysm. And one of the risks of pseudoaneurysms is an acute thrombosis of the aneurysm and the vessels below. So he develops a pseudoaneurysm. For all that period of time, there's normal flow. Somewhere within 12 hours of his arrival to St. Luke's on the second admission, second time, is when he abruptly occludes that pseudoaneurysm. But up until that period of time, there's essentially normal flow to the foot.
If he had a pseudoaneurysm and an intimal flap tear, can the intimal flap tear then cause a partial clotting or partial disruption of the flow into the artery?
Well, the history of intimal flaps is that they either heal themselves or they abruptly thrombose. So again, with this respect to, if we're going to, and I don't believe this was an intimal flap injury, but even intimal flaps, basically you've got normal flow until you get a major dissection and thrombosis of the vessel. So by and large, even with intimal flaps, you go from essentially normal flow to a complete occlusion of the vessel within several minutes.
And that has been your experience as a vascular surgeon?
Correct, and that's the study of the mechanism of action that I have come across.
Okay. Now, did you read Mr. Tolson's deposition testimony where he had complained of a cold foot? Did you take that into account when reaching your opinions in this case?
Sure.
Objection.
Okay. And how did you deal with that fact?
Well, in several ways. First of all, when Mr. Tolson says he has a, quote, cold foot, that within a reasonable degree of medical certainty has to be that, let me go back for a second. Patients commonly come to my office and say, I have cold feet. And that can mean one of two things. It can either mean that they touched their foot with their hand and felt like they were holding an ice cube in their hand. So their hand felt the coldness of the foot. Or, as most of my patients do, they have this perception that their foot is cold. Now, the perception of your foot being cold has nothing to do with the vascular perfusion of the foot or even whether it's warm or cold. It's more of a neurologic feeling. Now, Mr. Tolson, I don't believe, would have touched his foot with his hand because it would have been virtually impossible for him to do that. He's overweight, and he could have only touched it in one of two ways, either doing a full deep bend, either standing or lying down, and getting his hand all the way down to his foot, which, given the fact that that's hard to do even for supple people, much less obese people, and the fact that doing it would have put strains on his knee, I don't believe he ever touched his foot with his hand. Number two, the other way to do it is they draw if I were to ask you, for example, to touch your foot with your hand, your first instinct would be to draw your foot up to your hand as you reach out with your hand. Mr. Tolson was in no position to draw his foot up and flex his knee. Would have been way too excruciating to do that based on whatever knee injury he had. So his perception of his foot being cold meant he felt it was cold. Well, he's had a neurologic injury to the nerve. It's going to have all sorts of perceptual differences for him as a person. It may feel like my foot's sitting in the snow, for example. But that's a feeling, doesn't mean that the foot is actually cold or has no perfusion. So that's part of it. Other part of it is, when you have these kinds of injuries, you're damaging all of the nerves that go to the lower leg. That includes the sympathetics and parasympathetics. And so it's very common to get vasoconstriction in the vessels such that while you have normal, essentially arterial flow, the skin, like when we go out in the cold weather and we have a normal response to vasoconstrict our vessels, that the skin may get cool and it may feel cold simply because the patient's vasoconstricting from the sympathetic discharge. So for all those reasons, yeah, I took that into account, but it's clearly to me, it's not because of lack of perfusion, it's because of vasoconstriction if somebody else felt his foot, and likely his foot was sticking out of the covers, or because he had significant vasoconstriction, and one would expect his foot to feel cold. I think his complaint of my foot feels cold had to be this perception that it feels like my foot's like in a tub of ice, as opposed to I touched my foot, because I don't believe he could have easily touched his foot.
How does a provider distinguish between a cold foot from vasoconstriction versus a lack of blood supply to the foot?
Feel a pulse. If you've got a pulse, it's for vasoconstriction. I have that in my office all the time. Elderly people commonly complain of cold feet. and I bring them into the office and I feel their pulses, and they've got strong pulses. And I mean, in the elderly population, people tend, as you get older, to try to preserve your inner energy, inner heat, and they vasoconstrict their extremities.
Do you believe more likely than not that Mr. Tolson's foot was cold to the touch because of vasoconstriction in this case?
Wait. Objection to the improper foundation. It's not been established his foot was cold to the touch.
Did you hear my objection?
Yes.
Yeah, we did several times.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't tell if I had spoken over Danielle.
I would say it this way. If somebody touched his foot, as there's a question as to whether somebody touched his foot with or without a sock on, if they touched his foot and it felt cool or cold, then it would have been from vasoconstriction.
Do you have an opinion why the attempted repair by Dr. Wilkerson of the popliteal artery did not work?
Sure, yes.
What is that, Doc?
Well, that's the problem. We do a lot of revascularizations. And as long we generally can do them, because there's some flow maintained in the distal tissues such that the distal vessels remain patent and there is some perfusion to maintain the tissue integrity. The problem with the popliteal artery, and this is the one artery in the body, to a lesser extent the brachial artery, but the popliteal artery is the major issue, that in a patient who has not had arteriosclerotic vascular disease and therefore has not built up collaterals, when you abrupt, essentially the blood flow to all the tissues below your knee come through the popliteal artery. The reason for that is there's very little muscle crossing the knee, and most collateral vessels come through muscles. So when you abruptly occlude your popliteal artery, you get almost immediate and complete cessation of blood flow in the tissues. And that results in a couple of things. First of all, you get abrupt severe arterial insufficiency. And while we say we have this 4 to 6 hour window to revascularize an extremity before it's too late, with respect to the popliteal artery, it's probably not even that long, because you have no perfusion and the tissues start to die, especially the nerves, pretty rapidly. But more importantly, and the reason we lose these legs on such a high frequency, is that when blood stops flowing completely, it clots. And so what you have is you have a completely static system below the knee. There's no flow. And within certainly minutes, if not within an hour, all of the secondary, tertiary, and small vessels and veins in the leg tend to clot. And you can't reopen that. You can't reopen it with the thrombectomy catheters we use. We can't reopen it with the clot busters, because these are in the smaller vessels we can't reach. That's why abrupt acute occlusion of the popliteal artery is such a devastating injury, and why by the time he got to Dr. Wilkerson, even though we could reestablish a blood flow, and even sometimes using catheters we could even reestablish a pulse in the foot through the large vessels, what we can't do is reestablish flow in the smaller vessels that have clotted.
Are there any other portions of the medical chart that you've relied upon that you've already talked about in order to reach your opinion that this abrupt thrombosis occurred about 12 hours before he went back to St. Agnes Hospital on the 5th? I know you mentioned the myoglobin levels. Is there anything other in particular?
As I can sit here right now, no. I don't, not that I can sit here. I think that was pretty pertinent. All those things I mentioned were the pertinent issues.
Including Dr. Wilkerson's operative report, correct?
Right, well, that's what I'm saying, his findings at the time of surgery.
Yeah.
Right. Doctor, are you going to give any opinion as to what was the cause of the joint effusion in Mr. Tolson's left knee that was found on the plain film x-rays taken on December 3rd, 2009?
Well, to the extent that I've certainly seen my fair number of knee injuries and had them myself, whenever you traumatize the knee, you tend to get fluid in the knee, both blood and fluid. I mean, I'll leave it up to an orthopedic surgeon to certainly opine on more minute details, but I think most people know when you twist or injure your knee, it tends to swell, and that's fluid.
And more likely than not, did you believe that the effusion was caused by the injury Mr. Tolson sustained when his leg got caught in the fence?
Oh, I would think so, yeah.
And the effusion that you talked about, it's a combination of fat and blood?
Objection.
As I understand it, it's
No foundation, not an issue in the case anymore based on Judge White's ruling.
I would say most effusions are simply fluid and some blood in the knee. I'm not aware of fat being a major component to an effusion, but I'm not an orthopod.
And the bleeding that made up part of the effusion, was that from a bleeding from the popliteal artery or from other smaller blood vessels? Do you have any opinion one way or the other on that?
I do.
Objection to form.
What is your opinion?
It's from the tears in the tissues and the trauma to the tissues. I don't think the artery ever had. If the artery had bled, he would have pretty much bled pretty severely, and it would have been rather obvious at the time that he was in the emergency room. So this is what you always get. You tear tissues, you tear ligaments, you get some bleeding, and it takes very little blood to make an effusion look bloody.
Did you note the vascular studies that were done on Mr. Tolson's leg?
I'm not sure which ones you're referring to.
Okay. Are you relying upon the vascular studies that were done on his leg for any of the opinions that you're giving in this case?
I would think not.
Okay. And doctor, for a patient to suffer a reduction in the flow of blood to his left lower extremity to result in a cold limb, a cold foot, can you give me an idea of the percentage of reduction that, in your opinion, you would have to have in order for that condition to develop?
Objection to form.
No, because it's so variable. And we have patients who have very little blood flow to their feet, but somehow, because of vasodilatation, have a warm foot. And I have people who have normal blood flow to their foot, and because of vasoconstriction, have a cool foot or cold foot. So I don't think you can really say. Certainly if you lose all of the blood flow to your foot, you're generally going to have a foot that's going to approximate room temperature at some point in time, because there's nothing otherwise to keep it warm. But beyond that, I can't tell you the amount of blood flow that you would have relative to the temperature of the skin.
Has it been your experience that patients with injuries to the popliteal arteries can still present with positive pedal pulses?
With certain kinds of injuries, they can, sure. This patient had an injury to his popliteal artery and presented with a palpable pulse. So clearly, yes, you can have an injury to your popliteal artery and still present with a popliteal pulse, a pedal pulse.
Okay. And what would And what would those type of injuries occur, other than what we know happened to Mr. Tolson?
Objection to form.
Can you have an intimal tear of the intimal flap and still have a positive pedal pulse?
Yes, you can until it thrombosis, or it may heal and you may never have a problem.
And can you have a pseudoaneurysm with positive popliteal pulses?
Which is what we had for a period here. Yes.
Okay. And let me ask you again, and I don't know whether, do you know for sure when the pseudoaneurysm developed? Not thrombosed, but actually developed.
Well, I would say that it probably started developing about 3 to 6 hours after he left the emergency room, based on the fact that it takes some time for the tissues to begin to stretch and weaken. So I would say, it could have been towards the end as he was being discharged, a few hours later, but certainly within a few hours of that period of time.
Does the period of time that it takes for the tissues to stretch and weaken, is it dependent upon the severity of the trauma to the artery at the time of the injury?
I would say to some extent that would be the more impact, the more likely you are to have a pseudoaneurysm. But you could also have a minimal impact that sort of just happened to pinch the artery in a way that damaged a small area. So it's variable, but I think to some extent, amount of force, greater force is going to tend to injury a vessel more.
And then that would shorten the 3 to 6 hour time from perhaps a 1 to 2 hour time when the aneurysm could start to develop?
No, because what we're talking about is whether the artery is injured to the point that it's eventually going to start to break down and stretch. That's not going to happen for at least a few hours. It takes time, unless you actually cut the artery. You have a hole in the artery and the blood immediately comes out and becomes a pseudoaneurysm, which I don't think happened here at all because this was not a penetrating trauma. And that's generally in penetrating trauma. When in blunt trauma, blunt force, it takes a few hours for that wall to weaken enough, no matter what the energy, to begin to weaken enough to actually stretch and become a pseudoaneurysm.
Okay. So regardless of the amount of trauma, it still takes several hours for the artery to weaken, providing it's not a penetrating injury.
Correct.
Still takes several hours to develop the pseudoaneurysm.
As long as whatever trauma that was didn't actually cause a hole in the artery, which it didn't here, it's going to take a few hours to actually begin to stretch and develop a pseudoaneurysm.
Is that whether or not an intimal tear occurred at the time or not?
Correct. An intimal tear is a whole other issue. An intimal tear is more of an issue where you have basically an intact vessel. The intima tears and blood begins to dissect under the tear into the wall and closes off the lumen from a different mechanism. That was not the case here because this patient had a pseudoaneurysm.
And you do not believe that he suffered from an intimal tear?
Certainly not as a cause of his thrombosis. Could there have been some intimal injury? Sure. But it wasn't an intimal tear. There was not a dissection noted. This was a pseudoaneurysm.
Have we covered all of the opinions that you intend to give in this case?
Objection.
So it's a hard question to answer. I think I've covered most of what I wanted to say. I mean, obviously I'd respond to other questions, but I think we've covered most of what I feel are the causation issues. I think we've touched upon the fact that I think that, the pulses were assessed, and in my opinion, that means that the vasculature was intact at that point. And my causation opinions have definitely been elucidated.
Doctor, is palpating for pulses somewhat subjective in the medical profession?
I would say this. Certainly it takes some experience to know that you're doing it right. But in a reasonably healthy patient with that arteriosclerosis, it's generally a straightforward, easy thing for most any healthcare practitioner to do. The reason for that is that where it becomes difficult is in vascular paths. Patients who have significant arterial disease have calcified vessels. And in those patients, appreciating a pulse is not always very easy. When you're dealing with a patient in this age group who has no significant arterial disease and the vessels have reasonable elasticity, generally speaking, it's a pretty straightforward thing for most healthcare providers. And certainly here we had 3 people who have either on the record or testified in deposition that they felt pulses.
Doctor, is simply the presence of a pulse, in your opinion, enough to conclude that the patient has an adequate flow of blood into their foot?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you have to have open flow through either no or very minimally narrowed vessels to be able to transmit the impulse of arterial flow to the vessel to expand it to be perceived by fingers. So yes.
So in order for you to conclude that Mr. Tolson was suffering from a lack of blood supply into his leg on December 3rd, 2009, while I was in St. Agnes Hospital, you would have to see one of the providers write in the report that they could not find a pedal pulse in his foot. Would that be accurate?
I would say if one person couldn't find a pedal pulse, but 2 or 3 other people did, that doesn't mean that he didn't have pedal pulses. Clearly, if 3 people said they did not feel a pulse, then I could not conclude that the vessels were open.
Okay. So I guess, and let me get this. Your opinion then is assuming that the providers who actually tested Mr. Tolson for positive pedal pulses performed that assessment accurately.
Yes, I mean, at least one of them I would think did.
Are you going to be giving any opinion as to how frequently the providers should have assessed Mr. Tolson's pulse while he was in the emergency room?
No, I think an assessment is appropriate, and they did it.
And have we covered all of the factual basis for the opinions that you intend to give in this case?
Objection.
I believe so. I mean,
Okay. All right.
I can't think of anything offhand.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have no questions. Mary Pat,
Yep,
do you have any questions?
I do not.
Okay, we'll read and
I'm
sign.
going to hang up on you.
Right.
Before you do that, Madam Court Reporter,
Oh, I'm sorry. Good point. Got it.
thank you. Can I just have an electronic copy, mini, 4 to a page?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Do you have my information?
Yes, I believe I do.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much.
The videographer has to go off the record.
This is the end of tape 1 of the videotape deposition of Dr. Gary Rubin. This deposition concludes at 2:11.